The most expensive meal in Los Angeles history wasn't served on a plate. It was served ice cold by Dean Martin to a restaurant owner who thought he could maintain segregated seating while keeping his most famous customer happy. On a humid evening in August 1965, Antonio Castellano made the fatal mistake of telling Dean Martin that he could continue dining at Ristorante Milano whenever he pleased, but that black customers would never be welcome in his establishment. What Castellano didn't understand was that Dean Martin's loyalty was stronger than his appetite, and his influence in Hollywood was more devastating than any weapon Castellano could imagine. Within 3 months, the restaurant that had been Dean's favorite gathering place for 8 years would be shuttered permanently, its reputation destroyed by the most sophisticated economic warfare campaign in Hollywood history. The man who thought he could segregate his dining room while keeping his celebrity clientele learned that some principles can't be compromised, and some betrayals demand the kind of revenge that only someone with Dean Martin's connections could deliver. The confrontation that would destroy Ristorante Milano began with a friendship and ended with financial ruin. It started as a conversation between old acquaintances and concluded as a masterclass in how to systematically dismantle a business using nothing but social influence and economic pressure. Most devastating of all, it proved that in a town where image was everything and connections meant survival, crossing Dean Martin was a form of professional suicide that no amount of good food or elegant atmosphere could overcome. Ristorante Milano had been Dean Martin's sanctuary for nearly a decade. Nestled in the heart of Beverly Hills, the restaurant represented everything that Dean valued in dining: authentic Italian food, prepared by people who understood that a meal was about more than nutrition. It was about family, tradition, and the kind of hospitality that made guests feel like they were dining in someone's home rather than a commercial establishment. The restaurant's owner, Antonio Castellano, was a second-generation Italian-American who had built his reputation on serving the kind of food that reminded successful immigrants of the homeland they had left behind in pursuit of American dreams. Dean had discovered Ristorante Milano in 1957, during the early years of his solo career when he was transitioning from his partnership with Jerry Lewis and establishing himself as an independent performer. The restaurant had become his regular meeting place for business dinners, casual meals with friends, and the kind of quiet evenings when he wanted to enjoy good food without the performance pressure that came with more public venues. Castellano had always treated Dean with the deference due to a valued customer, providing discreet service, excellent food, and the kind of comfortable atmosphere that made the restaurant feel like an extension of Dean's own home. But Ristorante Milano's success had been built on a foundation that Dean didn't fully understand until the summer of 1965. The restaurant maintained its upscale clientele by quietly but systematically excluding black customers. The discrimination was subtle and sophisticated, accomplished through a combination of unlisted phone numbers, word-of-mouth reservations, and the kind of social gatekeeping that allowed establishments to maintain segregation without posting explicit signs or making public declarations about their racial policies. The crisis that would expose this hidden segregation began on a Saturday evening in early August when Dean arrived at Ristorante Milano for dinner with a group that included Sammy Davis Jr., Nancy Sinatra, and producer George Sidney. They were celebrating the completion of a recording session, and Dean had suggested Milano as the perfect place for an intimate dinner where they could relax without attracting the attention that would have accompanied a meal at more visible Hollywood establishments. When Dean's group arrived at the restaurant at 8 o'clock, they were greeted by the hostess, Maria Castellano, Antonio's daughter, who had grown up working in the family business and knew Dean as one of their most valued customers. But when she saw Sammy Davis Jr. among Dean's party, her welcoming smile faltered slightly, replaced by the kind of uncomfortable expression that suggested she was facing a situation she had hoped never to encounter. "Mr. Martin," Maria said, her voice carrying a tension that Dean immediately noticed. "We're so happy to see you tonight, but I'm afraid we're completely booked this evening. We simply don't have a table available for your party." Dean looked around the restaurant, which was clearly not at capacity. Several tables were empty, and the atmosphere was relaxed rather than frantically busy. He had been dining at Milano for 8 years and had never been told they were too busy to accommodate him, regardless of whether he had made a reservation. "That's strange, Maria," Dean said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm that people who knew him understood as a danger signal.
I can see at least 4 empty tables from here. Are those reserved for other parties?
Maria's discomfort was becoming more obvious by the moment. Those tables they're being held for regular customers who have standing reservations. Sammy Davis Jr., who had experienced this kind of situation countless times throughout his career, understood exactly what was happening. But rather than create a scene, he gently touched Dean's arm and said, "Dean, why don't we try somewhere else tonight? I know a great place in West Hollywood." But Dean Martin wasn't ready to leave without understanding exactly what was happening. "Maria, is there a problem with our party that I should know about?" Before Maria could respond, Antonio Castellano emerged from the kitchen, apparently having been summoned to handle the situation that his daughter was struggling to manage. Castellano was a man in his 60s who had built his restaurant through a combination of excellent food and careful attention to the social expectations of his upscale clientele. He approached Dean's group with the kind of forced smile that suggested he was about to deliver news he hoped would be received without argument. "Dean, my friend," Castellano said, extending his hand in greeting while carefully avoiding eye contact with Sammy. "What a pleasure to see you tonight. I'm afraid Maria is correct. We're completely booked this evening, but perhaps we could arrange something for tomorrow night. A beautiful table, just for you." Dean shook Castellano's hand, but his expression remained neutral. "Antonio, we're here tonight because I wanted to show my friends your wonderful restaurant. Is there really no way you can accommodate us?" Castellano glanced nervously at the other patrons in the restaurant, several of whom were watching the interaction with interest. "Dean, you know you're always welcome here. You're like family to us. But tonight, with the reservations we already have, it would be impossible to provide the kind of service you deserve." Nancy Sinatra, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stepped forward. "Mr. Castellano, couldn't you put us at that corner table? It looks like it's available." Castellano's discomfort increased visibly. "That table it's reserved for the Whitman party. They'll be arriving shortly." Dean's patience was beginning to wear thin, not because he was being inconvenienced, but because he was starting to understand the real reason his party was being turned away. "Antonio, let me ask you a direct question. If I came here tonight alone, would you have a table for me?" Castellano nodded eagerly. "Of course, Dean. For you, always." Dean's next question was delivered with the kind of quiet intensity that made everyone present understand they were witnessing something significant. "And if I came here with Nancy, would you have a table for us?" Castellano looked confused by the question. "Certainly. Nancy is always welcome here." Dean looked directly at Sammy, then back at Castellano. "And what if I came here with my friend Sammy? Would you have a table for the two of us?" The silence that followed was profound and devastating. Castellano's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, and finally resignation to the fact that he was going to have to make his racial policies explicit. "Dean," Castellano said quietly, "you have to understand. This is a family restaurant. We cater to a particular clientele. Our customers have certain expectations about the atmosphere they'll encounter when they dine here." Dean's voice remained calm, but everyone present could feel the anger building beneath the surface. "Are you telling me that Sammy Davis Jr. isn't welcome in your restaurant?" Castellano tried to find a way to explain his position without sounding explicitly racist. "It's not personal, Dean. Sammy is a talented man, a successful entertainer. But our customers come here for a specific kind of dining experience. Mixing different types of people can make some guests uncomfortable." Dean Martin had heard enough. He understood exactly what Castellano was saying, and he understood that the restaurant he had considered a second home for 8 years was built on a foundation of racial exclusion that he had been unconsciously supporting with his patronage. "I see," Dean said, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that people who knew him recognized as far more dangerous than shouting would have been. "So you're saying that I can continue to eat here whenever I want, but my friends aren't welcome if they happen to be black?" Castellano, sensing that he was losing a valued customer, tried to find middle ground. "Dean, you're always welcome here. You're family to us. This isn't about you. It's about maintaining the kind of atmosphere that our clientele expects." Dean's response was swift and final. "Antonio, let me explain something to you. If my friends aren't welcome here, then I'm not welcome here. And if I'm not welcome here, then a lot of other people aren't going to be welcome here either. With that declaration, Dean Martin turned and walked out of Ristorante Milano for the last time. Sammy Davis Jr., Nancy Sinatra, and George Sidney followed him, leaving Castellano standing in his restaurant's foyer with the growing realization that he had just made a catastrophic business decision. But Dean's departure was only the beginning of Castellano's problems. What happened over the next 3 months would demonstrate the difference between individual disappointment and systematic destruction, between losing a customer and losing a business. Dean Martin didn't publicly announce a boycott of Ristorante Milano. He didn't give interviews to gossip columnists or make speeches about discrimination in the restaurant industry. Instead, he began a campaign of economic warfare that was as sophisticated as it was devastating, using his connections throughout Hollywood to systematically dismantle Castellano's business. The campaign began with phone calls. Dean started reaching out to friends, colleagues, and business associates, casually mentioning that he was no longer dining at Ristorante Milano and suggesting alternative venues for business meetings and social gatherings. He didn't explain why he had stopped patronizing the restaurant. He simply made it clear that it was no longer a place he recommended. Frank Sinatra was the first to receive one of these calls. "Frank, if you're looking for a good Italian place, you might want to try Matteo's on Westwood Boulevard. The food is excellent and the atmosphere is very welcoming." Sinatra understood immediately what Dean was communicating. Within a week, Sinatra had canceled a planned private dinner at Milano and was telling his own associates that he preferred dining elsewhere. The network of influence that Dean activated was vast and interconnected. Producers received suggestions for alternative venues when they asked about locations for business dinners. Agents found themselves being steered away from Milano when they mentioned plans for client entertainment. Directors discovered that their usual dining spots were suddenly being replaced by recommendations for restaurants that offered a more comfortable atmosphere. Nancy Sinatra began hosting her industry gatherings at different venues, mentioning casually to other entertainers that Milano was not as convenient as it used to be. George Sidney started booking his production meetings at restaurants that were more accommodating to diverse groups. Each conversation, each suggestion, each redirection was a small cut that began to bleed away Milano's customer base. The damage was subtle at first. Castellano noticed that some of his regular customers weren't making reservations as frequently as they had in the past, but he attributed this to the natural ebb and flow of business. Hollywood was a notoriously fickle town, and restaurants often experience periods of reduced popularity without any apparent cause. But by September, the decline was becoming undeniable. Tables that had been consistently booked were sitting empty. Phone calls for reservations were becoming less frequent. The lunch crowds that had sustained the restaurant's daily operations were diminishing noticeably. More troubling were the conversations that Castellano was beginning to overhear among his staff. Waiters mentioned that customers were asking about Dean Martin, wondering why he hadn't been seen at the restaurant recently. Other patrons made casual comments about preferring restaurants where everyone feels welcome, suggestions that Castellano's racial policies were becoming known throughout the Hollywood community. The final blow came in October when Castellano realized that he wasn't just losing individual customers, he was losing entire social and professional networks. Producer Hal Wallis, who had been hosting monthly dinners at Milano for over 2 years, quietly moved his gatherings to a different venue. Director Billy Wilder stopped bringing his European guests to Milano, explaining to his assistant that he preferred restaurants with a more inclusive atmosphere. The economic mathematics of Dean Martin's revenge were brutal and precise. Each lost customer represented not just individual meals, but the entire network of people that customer might have brought to the restaurant. Each canceled reservation was a domino that toppled other potential bookings. Each suggestion to dine elsewhere was a recommendation that influenced dozens of other dining decisions. By November, Ristorante Milano was operating at less than 40% capacity. Castellano was forced to lay off staff, reduce his hours of operation, and begin considering whether the restaurant could survive financially. The establishment that had been a fixture in Beverly Hills dining for over a decade was dying slowly, killed not by bad food or poor service, but by the systematic withdrawal of the social network that had sustained its success. The end came in December, when Castellano's landlord, who was also feeling pressure from property owners who preferred tenants with more stable clienteles, declined to renew Milano's lease. The restaurant, that had once been Dean Martin's favorite dining establishment, closed its doors permanently on December 21, 1965, exactly 4 months after Castellano had told Dean that black customers would never be welcome in his establishment. Castellano never publicly acknowledged the connection between Dean's departure and his restaurant's demise, but those in the industry understood exactly what had happened. Dean Martin had demonstrated that in a community built on relationships and recommendations, ostracizing people based on race was not just morally wrong, it was economically suicidal. The space that had housed Ristorante Milano was eventually leased to a new restaurant that made a point of welcoming all customers regardless of race and which explicitly advertised its commitment to inclusive dining. The new establishment thrived, drawing customers who appreciated both good food and the restaurant's values. Dean Martin never publicly discussed the Milano incident, but friends noticed that his subsequent dining choices were made with careful attention to restaurants' racial policies. He became a regular at establishments that served integrated clienteles, and his recommendations carried particular weight because everyone knew he had walked away from a restaurant he genuinely loved rather than support segregation. Sammy Davis Jr. in his autobiography would later reference the incident without naming the restaurant, writing, "There are people in this business who talk about equality and people who practice it." Dean Martin never gave speeches about civil rights, but when it came time to choose between comfort and conscience, he chose conscience. And he made sure that choice had consequences. The story of Ristorante Milano became part of Hollywood's oral tradition, a cautionary tale about the costs of racial discrimination in an industry that was becoming increasingly integrated. It demonstrated that exclusion wasn't just morally wrong, it was professionally dangerous in a community where reputation and relationships determined success. More importantly, it showed that economic pressure could be more effective than legal challenges in forcing businesses to abandon discriminatory practices. Dean Martin hadn't sued Ristorante Milano or picketed its entrance. He had simply made it clear that supporting segregation would cost the restaurant the social connections that were essential to its survival. Antonio Castellano disappeared from the Los Angeles restaurant scene after Milano closed, reportedly moving to a smaller city where his views about racial separation were more widely shared. But the lesson of his restaurant's destruction lived on. In Hollywood, where diversity was becoming an economic asset rather than a social burden, maintaining segregated policies was a form of business suicide. The brutal efficiency of Dean Martin's revenge had taught an entire industry that some betrayals demanded complete destruction, and that a man who would sacrifice his favorite restaurant for his principles was not someone whose friendship should be taken lightly. In the end, Ristorante Milano had served its last meal not because the food was bad or the service was poor, but because its owner had made the fatal mistake of believing he could maintain both Dean Martin's patronage and his racist policies. Dean had proved that some choices were mutually exclusive, and that the consequences of choosing wrongly could be both swift and total.